There was another piece of it, which is it was very difficult to get continuous data from patients. So like once we sequenced for the doctors, our service was done. We had no ability to go back to the individual and say, hey, we'd love to know, this drug that we thought you would respond to, did you respond to it? Right? Like we want to build predictive algorithms. We need to know whether they're predictive, right? So that kind of feedback loop is very difficult when you're not in direct contact and don't have direct incentives with an individual. So started to realize like, there's obvious applications to Web3 and crypto economics here. I mean, we're just a small piece of this larger movement. It's our thesis that you can just increase the quality and the speed of scientific progress if it's more decentralized. And the transaction cost becomes so low, right? And so like the transaction cost associated with collaborating with the different scientists is so high because you need to get lawyers involved, you need to form a research agreement, you need to sign NDAs. Like it's just, by the time you run the calculation of how much is it going to cost to collaborate with this person, it's so high, it's just not worth it, right? And so this is why everyone keeps things close to their chest. But when it becomes as easy as just submitting transactions to Ethereum, the incentive to collaborate becomes super high, right? Because it costs nothing to collaborate, right? Like very, very little. And now you're both incentivized to contribute data and value to this underlying piece of IP. And so this is what we see as the future of DeSci. It's just like where all these scientists are just incentivized to collaborate with each other. That's it. Like it's quite simple. It's really, really simple. It's just you want people to want to collaborate, right?
Sean, Benji, thanks so much for joining us. This is episode 6 of the DFI Podcast. We're going to go deep on Web3 infrastructure. And today, Benji, thank you so much for joining us and with us and spending some time.
My pleasure. I'm as grateful as I am unqualified to be here. So thanks for having me.
Well, it's not sure how much more qualified we are to be doing this podcast. So it's all good. Well, I'm super excited. First time we're having a guest on the pod, so that's going to be fun. And Benji, thanks for joining us. Super excited to learn more about you and just like the stuff that you've been working on. Do you want to give us a little like background about yourself? Where your background, how you got into Web3, a little bit about your undergrad, stuff like that.
Sure. Yeah. And I'll try to be as brief as possible. But yeah, like with the caveat that I think my background has led me to this interesting spot within Molecule that I think really took kind of this weird path that I've taken to get to. And so, yeah, I originally am from San Diego, and San Diego is just like a massive biotech hub for those who are in that space. There's a ton of really cool biotech companies, diagnostics companies coming out of there. And it was definitely like an early spark of interest into the life sciences space. So grew up down the street from Illumina, which has really completely changed the genomics industry. And yeah, and the Craig Venter Institute. So Craig Venter basically ran the Human Genome Project in a private lab. And so these were kind of like my early inspirations. I went and studied bioengineering here in Chicago. That's what led me here. I studied it in the chemical engineering department at Northwestern. They had this really cool synthetic biology department. So as soon as I kind of started to make the analogies between like computer science and genetics, I kind of like realized that there was no going back, realizing that biology is a programmable substrate and we have the ability to engineer it now. Kind of just made me realize that we have this next level in human evolution that is really going to change the course of our lives and hopefully generations below us. And yeah, bringing, I think, genetic medicines is one of the biggest untapped potentials for medicine and for humanity. So definitely wanted to figure out how do I create the most impact in this space. Did some academic research, quickly realized my impact would not be on the academic research side of things. I get bored pretty easily and have a really short attention span. And that's just not the mindset to have for academic research, which does take time to, kind of iterate with experimental design and whatnot. I went and actually wearing the shirt. I worked for a company called Tempus straight out of college, and Tempus does genomics on human tumors. So we basically support oncologists, I left them a few years ago. They do genomic sequencing on human tumors for oncologists to make treatment decisions. So basically doctors run out of options, patients started failing all treatments. And now they basically need like kind of what's typically like a last hope, like a last ditch effort to save the patients. And, with the advent of more targeted therapies, there are actually pretty good biomarkers to predict response. And especially for certain cancer types, if you can actually find the genetic biomarkers from genomic sequencing, you can figure out which therapies a patient will respond to. So it was really interesting work there. We did a ton of super cool oncology research and genetics research, and got to build a few pretty cool algorithms there. And then, I think one of the reasons I got so interested in Web3 from the get-go was, the company I worked for, Tempest, we basically aggregated all this patient data, monetized the heck out of it. And, the patients saw very little, if any, of that value. And all of their data was kind of being monetized essentially behind their backs. And that really bothered me. And there was another piece of it, which I think Web3 has the power to disrupt this, which is it was very difficult to get continuous data from patients. So like once we sequenced for the doctors, our service was done. We had no ability to go back to the individual and say, hey, we'd love to know, this drug that we thought you would respond to, did you respond to it? Right? Like we want to build predictive algorithms. We need to know whether they're predictive, right? So that kind of feedback loop is very difficult when you're not in direct contact and don't have direct incentives with an individual. So started to realize like, there's obvious applications to Web3 and crypto economics here. And so I ended up going to venture capital for a bit to try and better understand all the incentives at play that go on with, the financialization of human health data and whatnot. And while I was there, one of the advisors to Molecule, his name's Chris Leiter, he sent over Molecule's deck. And I've never been so fascinated by something to such a degree that I just basically sucked up all the information on it within a period of 2 days. And convinced my fund to invest. And pretty shortly thereafter joined the team. So it's been great. I'm now on the product team there, and can go more into depth about the work that we're doing. And apologies for the ramble.
No, that's fantastic. That's a very good ramble. I appreciate that. It's a lot of helpful background. And it looks like you've been involved in a lot of different spaces. A lot of folks listening may not have exposure to decentralized science or just the basics of how it works. Could you give any high level overview of thoughts of how it's organized or what it's trying to achieve?
So a DeSci, what it basically does is it looks at all the institutions within science as bureaucracy and barriers to actual scientific progress, right? So basically looking at how science has become institutionalized and seeing how that's actually doing such a disservice to human progress. And so trying to swing the pendulum back to a decentralized structure from what exists right now, which is a very centralized structure, in order to just increase the rate of scientific progress. So there's different ways, obviously, you can approach that. The way that Molecule is approaching it is from the intellectual property perspective, but there are a ton of really cool projects going after publishing or the actual execution of science or the peer review process. So there's so many different ways that institutions have manifested to the peril of science. And so, we're just a small piece of this larger movement, as you mentioned, which is to kind of disrupt the institutions of science to, increase its decentralization, because it's our thesis that you can just increase the quality and the speed of scientific progress if it's more decentralized. And then how VitaDAO plays into that space specifically. So VitaDAO is basically looking at how do we fund longevity research in this decentralized mechanism where we say, okay, the NIH, all these existing funding bodies, venture capital, all the private funding bodies aren't doing the types of research that we want. They're not actually funding the projects that we think are promising. And so we're just going to do it ourselves. So basically the idea is you have a group of people, they're all bullish or, patients of a certain disease that they want research funded toward. And so they say, hey, let's just all pool together our money. take matters into our own hands and go fund that research, because the medical system, the scientific funding system has just failed us. So we, either we do it or nobody else will. And then what Molecule does is we kind of just support these communities. Yeah, we support these communities to try and give them just the technological tools to go and execute on this.
Very cool. I actually have a couple follow-ups to that. This sounds really interesting space. I know Wes has had a lot more exposure to DeSci than I have. So out of curiosity, why is there, there's like a belief in Web3 in general that in centralized technical changes, centralized economic and legal changes to the software industry will make, significant improvements to data privacy or user experience and things like that. In your opinion, what are the features of centralized science that is holding back scientific progress? I think this is really interesting. It's the first time I've ever heard anyone mention something like that.
It's the core question. And it comes down to, as it always does in crypto, incentives, right? So let's put ourselves in the shoes of an NIH grant funder, right? So you're sitting in the NIH, an application for a grant comes across your desk. You are probably a renowned expert in this field based on the research that you've done, right? Which has basically validated certain hypotheses and is pushing a disease understanding in a certain direction. You are obviously going to want to fund projects that further that hypothesis, right? And not fund anything that doesn't touch that, right? So because you and your citations, you're trying to be seen as the godfather or, godmother of a certain field of research and a certain direction that went. And so there becomes this incentive to just basically pump your own bags in the scientific or academic sense, right? So now think about it from the perspective. So that's just, broad brushstrokes. I don't want to diminish the work that these types of people do. It's just, I think you have to boil everything down to its explicit incentives. Now let's look at a patient, right? So patient is sick, right? They're hurting personally, physically, right? Very, very different incentives than someone who is just a researcher who does it out of academic and professional interests, right? So you have a patient who's hurting. They want to alleviate that suffering. All they care about is cures, right? They're just trying to solve the problem. And so the idea is, if you can leverage that mindset and that desperation, you can channel it to good. You can channel it toward cure, developing cures. And our thesis is that the quality and the speed that drugs will be developed that are patient first are actually going to be higher quality and done less expensively than the current system. So this also kind of generalizes to things like venture capital and pharma as well, right? So in the venture capital space, when you invest into a company, your goal is not to alleviate your own suffering and find the highest quality drugs. It is to return the fund, right? It is to get a return for your limited partners. Obviously broad brushstrokes. There are lots of great people that are very impact investment focused, but primarily speaking, it's a financial game, right? And so very different game than high quality drugs, right? So it all boils down to this principal agent problem that exists in science and especially medical research, which is the patients are basically relying on these other entities to bring them cures. And those entities are not necessarily motivated by the same incentives, right? So this has led to the grossly expensive and actually fairly inefficient medical system that we have. And so, yeah, I think, I hope this takes the conversation in the direction of crypto economics, but that's at a high level, that's kind of how we think about it.
Very cool. So are there examples or some diseases that you know of that, because there's maybe not a lot of money in it or whatever, pharma and venture capital are not investing, but VitaDAO or Molecule or other people in decentralized science have started looking into ways of funding drug discovery for these diseases?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have this whole accelerator program within like an adjunct to Molecule. It's more of a DAO, but it's pretty strongly affiliated with Molecule, and it's called bio.xyz. And the goal is to kind of create like an accelerator program for these individual like disease areas that other people want to form biotech DAOs around. We have kind of our assumptions for what we think are good applications and diseases for this, but there's a lot of great ideas that we haven't thought about where people have come to us and said, hey, there's this disease and we never thought about it, but it actually turned out to be a great use case. One example of which is hair DAO. So hair DAO is focused on androgenic alopecia or male pattern balding. And this is a disease that gets $5 million per year in worldwide grant funding for research.
Wow.
And the global demand is, I think, between like $8 and $9 billion in terms of like the demand for products in that space. And the products are garbage. They're absolute garbage. There's like a few drugs, neither of which were developed for hair loss. They were developed for like blood pressure or prostate hyperplasia. And they just found out that all the people on these trials were growing hair. And so they repurposed it. So we're super bullish on hair loss now that we've seen some of the movement come from that community, but never would have thought of it ourselves. But it is this really interesting metric that you can look at, which is what is the global market size for a certain disease and its products versus what is the amount of money that's going into research in that area. And that dip is a mismatch in supply and demand, right? And so that's what we're trying to kind of fill, is bring the demand for early stage research directly to supply. And that's kind of what these DAOs are, right? Is the opportunity to fund early stage research where you never really could before productively in ways that you can actually go and develop drugs. And so, yeah, we've been working very closely with the AirDAO team, but there's also a few of the other groups coming out of the bio.xyz accelerator are AthenaDAO, which is focused on reproductive health, women's reproductive health, another, which also chronically underfunded, as well as psychedelics, which have been chronically underfunded, but are huge potential, a huge market size, but it's all kind of been in the shadows. Another is cryogenics. So, kind of like a hedge against longevity, which is just freezing yourself prior to death. And biostasis. So, if we don't find the cure for longevity in our lifetimes, there's basically another option, which is just to, freeze yourself and wait it out. And then another is ValiDAO, which is focused on synthetic biology, which is what I studied in college and definitely is close to my heart. So yeah, we have our own ideas of what we think are good applications, but also like there's such great ideas of people coming to us. We've had people come to us about long COVID as well, that are interested in starting long COVID DAOs. But yeah, just, shameless shill. Like if anyone has a great idea or application that they see, like please come talk to us. We're looking for that. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we support the shill. We're always happy to help people who are trying to make progress in science. So that's awesome. Yeah, Wes, do you want to go?
One follow-up question, thinking a little bit about the tech behind MoleculeDAO and VitaDAO success. Sometimes looking at groups like LabDAO, or there's a sort of this topic of reproducibility in science that comes up sometimes. Are you guys focused on that problem as well? Like does open source data or open source code play a part in this? Or in order to maintain the investment and the returns, does it still need to be this similar type of closed assets? Could you give us any sense of how that should play out?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a great answer for you, but I have some pretty vague answers for you. And I think a few things to consider are, number one, open source data and sustainable economics are relatively at odds with each other, right? Because IP is contingent on data being secretive, right? And private. Another thing to consider is that the most value you can get out of data is if you decentralize it, if you get it into the most people's hands, right? So you have these opposing forces where the highest probability of success from data itself and like leveraging, the data to make discoveries that are, like that result in financial returns is higher the more people you get it, but also the risk that it leaks is higher the more people that get it. And we're trying to thread this needle and trying to figure out how to. So I know this doesn't get at the reproducibility, but it gets to much more of what is the right mechanism to get valuable data to valuable data scientists so that insights can be made and value can be accrued. So I think that ultimately this is kind of like potentially a zero knowledge problem. It's also potentially like an encryption problem where you can get data at the level of granularity to where you can run algorithms and do statistics without being able to run off with the data itself and monetize it for your own good at the expense of the original data generators. So I think this is a problem that a lot of people are trying to solve. I think one cool group and one to note that is working on this is called CrunchDAO. LabDAO is of course another. But yeah, these are basically groups that are trying to help people get the most value out of their data without jeopardizing it. And I think that that is going to be a huge application and a great use case for encryption because those two forces are so important. And without either being satisfied, you're going to lose to the original system, which is closed source data, hire data scientists in-house, keep everything within your firewalls. Like, we know that's not the best path, but if you jeopardize data getting leaked, that's the like Nash equilibrium, you know?
I love it. I completely agree. It's a delicate balancing act, and it's very fun to hear your guys' perspective on how you might consume that technology because there's so much investment to your point about ZK sync, verifiable compute, multi-party compute, and all that stuff. So it's good to hear from you as a potential user that people building that could benefit from it. Maybe one last question for you, and then I'll hand it over to Ishan. You can give us a little context more about the financialization of the research. I know you guys are doing a lot of work. I a lot of times tell people, I think you guys are leading the space in terms of the IP-NFT and the work that you guys have done there. And I know you in particular have done a lot of work around thinking about fractionalization and those sorts of things. And I expect the space is changing rapidly. Could you give us just maybe for folks listening, kind of the state of what is an IP-NFT? Are you happy with how it's going? How would you like to see all that play out?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because yeah, there's so many different directions that this can go in, just not even within Molecule, but in terms of how intellectual property and blockchains meet, right? To create the most progress. And so we've chosen a specific design and direction. And I think that there are lots of other promising ones, some of which are coming out of Protocol Labs. We're very much following like the HyperSearch team and really bullish on what they're working on as well. And it'll be interesting to see the different use cases that are better fits for different primitives. And so, yeah, basically the IP-NFT primitive is a mechanism to get existing intellectual property in the real world on chain. So it's a way where if you have some sort of patent license or some sort of sponsored research agreement that gives you rights to intellectual property in some jurisdiction, that you can assign that to a token on chain, an NFT. And so that's what the IP-NFT does. So we have this contract. It's called the assignment agreement. We actually have it posted on GitHub. We've had it validated by several law firms. And they basically say that it does what we tell people it does, which is it assigns the legal rights to a token holder. And so that's actually super powerful because now you have an on-chain record of ownership over intellectual property. It makes the IP much more discoverable. It makes it much more liquid and transactable. And so going back to your question about fractionalization, this is actually something we just tested out for the first time. And so far, so good. There's definitely a lot of work still to be done, but VitaDAO, for one of its projects, they basically funded a longevity research project at the University of Newcastle in England. And they funded this researcher who's studying autophagy activators. And they wanted to raise more money for it. They also wanted to see what the value was to the community itself and also decentralized direct governance of that project to its community. And so we did a crowd sale for 10% of the project at the valuation that the community paid for it originally. And it raised over $600,000 worth of ETH. And yeah, now the project is freely trading. the token's called VITA-FAST. Fast because it's autophagy, and autophagy mimics fasting, or it's basically the biochemical like result of fasting. And also we thought fast was pretty memeable. But yeah, so the idea is to like financialize individual scientific projects. And I mean, ultimately, like we're in the crypto space. Everything comes down to tokens. Like people love tokens. And if you have a token that represents the governance and licensing of IP, that's valuable to people, especially the communities that are suffering from the disease that is being researched by the project. And so I think there's a lot of different mechanics that we can take the protocol in that I'm really excited to, take it in. But I think fundamentally we really want to validate that the primitive has value. And yeah, we have some initial signals, but so much more work to be done, honestly. Hope that answered your question.
Very helpful.
So like follow up on that. Who are the, what type of people, who are the people who are partaking in like the token sale for each of these projects? And how, I understand like, the token is freely trading. How do people who fund it, like, is it like charity for them, or are they also trying to make a return on investment? How does that work?
Got it. Yeah, it's an important question. And I think the important piece is the way we market the token is certainly not as an investment opportunity. We're trying to be very careful about how we pitch the expectations and the rights of token holders. So, just know that we have to be very careful about how we speak about that. And yeah, like we're very, very careful about what we say that it does, and don't say what it doesn't do and what you can't expect to happen. But most of the people that fund this work are people that are excited about longevity research, that aren't buying it for a return on investment. They're buying it because they want to support longevity research and they want to leverage the crypto wealth that they have to push that forward, right? The way I think about VitaDAO is you pool everyone's wealth so that they can enjoy their wealth for longer. And so I think that's kind of like the mantra of most of the people that participate. That being said, if the project does well, we hope that the community values the token more highly, but it can't be guaranteed. And ultimately we do see it as more philanthropic than speculative. But ultimately, like, what does the token do? Like, it governs the licensing function of the IP, which we think holds value, but also it's an incentive mechanism for people to help de-risk the IP. And we think this is also very powerful. So when a patient participates in a clinical trial, like for a pharmaceutical company, like in a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trial, they basically get the drug for free, but they don't receive any sort of governance or, ownership or rights to it, right? They just get the drug for free. And they're basically in service of the pharmaceutical company. We think that that's actually like going back to the whole incentivizing patients piece. We think it's a huge missed opportunity because you want the people that are creating the value of IP to own a piece of it, right? Think about the types of incentives you would create if people could own and govern the drugs that they basically helped bring to market, right? It creates a completely different like feedback loop where now, right now, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, like people distrust the heck out of it. It's one of the least trusted industries that exist versus now if the patients have a say and they can actually govern where the drug goes, how it's priced, who can get it, it completely changes the engagement with regard to the medical industry and actually incentivizes it versus making people averse to it. And so this is kind of our goal, is for people to actually enjoy the process of taking part in research and to enjoy, some of the benefits that come from it, including, ownership in the IP itself. And I think that just creates so much of a better and more efficient feedback loop between those who generate the value and those who capture it within the healthcare space. So yeah, like this is something we're super excited about. And that same kind of like ability to incentivize people who increase the value of IP, like it doesn't just go for patients. It goes for anyone who is willing to contribute. So they don't just have to suffer from the disease to take the therapy in a clinical trial to receive, a payment in the token, the IP token. They can also like just, run some sort of analysis where they, basically create value. They either find the drug target or they optimize the compound or, do something that's accretive to the value of the IP, and they get a piece of ownership too. We're trying to create this culture of being compensated in ownership over the IP versus just, a mercenary like fee for service model, right? Our goal is to find people that are so bullish on the IP itself that they're willing to work for compensation in that IP ownership as well.
Very cool. So, there's a bunch of interesting things that you said there that made me think about, maybe could you explain like the high level, like incentive design system that you guys have built and like the crypto economics, like surrounding that incentive design to like, incentivize good actors or like good research or good outcomes of these research studies and stuff like that?
So I don't think we have like a strong mechanism design quite yet. Our goal is to create the market first, right? And this is where like the original fractionalization beachhead with, this project at Newcastle with VitaDAO is so important, because what it does is at least create the market. And so, Wes asked a bit ago, like, what are you guys doing about reproducibility? And, directly, we're not doing anything other than creating a market where we're essentially creating a market for reproducibility, right? Like, what is the value of a certain data set? Well, it's probably going to be high for the first people to create that data, but for the second people to create that data, it's also valuable because, being able to show that you reproduced the original findings is valuable, but it's less valuable than the original data set itself, right? If a patient takes a drug and it doesn't kill them, that's pretty valuable, but that second patient is also valuable. But at a certain point, it becomes like diminishing returns, right? So I think that there's like a lot of like logarithmic incentives when it comes to data creation that start to look super interesting. So the way we think about like clinical trials, for example, is, you have this phase 1 study and that's 30 people and we look for these specific things and that's it. And that's what the trial's powered for. And once that's done, we present it to the FDA and then they give us approval to start phase 2. It's this very quantized way of doing science that actually is super inefficient because there's always these waiting periods. And ultimately, what you really want to do with drugs is de-risk them very iteratively and as low risk as possible. So imagine it different. And this is not something we're enforcing by any means, but it's something we've like been discussing, which is what if you just, have therapies go from the most desperate person to the least desperate person, like essentially in order, right? So you find the person who's in hospice, right? And they're so desperate, they'll do anything, right? It's just their last hope. And you realize that the drug doesn't kill them. Okay. That's good, valuable data, right? They deserve something for that. Their family deserves something for that. Let's go to the next high risk person, right? And so it's kind of like this sort of trickle down from most desperate and, least risky person taking a therapeutic all the way down to just, someone who's trying to take something prophylactically, right? Before the disease is manifested. And so I think that there is some sort of like logarithmic curve there where you map incentives where the first people to take a drug are taking the highest risk and therefore deserve the highest piece of ownership. But then as it becomes like you're beating a dead horse, like we know this thing is safe and effective, the rewards become diminishing. And you can look at this from like the patient perspective, participating in trials. You can also look at it for producing any data set of value. right? So this can be like a contract research organization studying, some sort of like target of a drug, right? Like what protein does it hit? The first person to find it, super valuable. The second person, still valuable, but less. And then it decreases over time. So yeah, I hope that tickles your crypto econ fancy, but like definitely something we've been thinking about.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Actually, how do you find the cohort of the most desperate people or the people who need this, cure or medicine the most? Otherwise, they might not live much longer. Like, is there a way to search for this, or have you guys found a novel way of finding this group of people?
It's such a good question. It was actually the impetus behind like molecule forming. So Paul Kohlhaas, the CEO, was like navigating patient forums. And that's kind of where the whole rabbit hole for him started, at least, was going through patient forums, seeing the desperation, seeing the experimentation when there is desperation, and realizing that the medical system is underserving a subset of patients. And so nowadays, the way you can kind of do this, either quantitatively or qualitatively, is to just go look at Reddit. Like, go look at Reddit, go find out where people are suffering. They will talk about it. Wherever there's suffering, there's a bunch of people that are trying to form communities to mitigate that suffering. That's like the baseline, right? Is people who hurt, at least try and find other people who understand them and they can share their pain with, right? And that's like the first level of these like patient DAOs that we see as being super useful. It's just having a community to talk to. That in and of itself is like partially therapeutic. And so go onto Reddit, find the communities of these patients where people are desperate, experimenting, trying out natural products to solve their diseases. There's so much stigma against like plant medicines and natural medicines, yet these people have tried what's on the market in a lot of cases and it's failed them. So they're trying whatever else is available. The question is, what can we make additionally available that also works, that's not like, necessarily like having a ton of these broccoli sprouts or taking this, $5,000 a month drug, right? So that was kind of like the way we've been thinking about looking at where these communities exist, is like they already exist, right? And you really want to tap into the communities that do exist, that have formed, that are already thinking deeply, doing research, sharing outcomes, experimenting, but they don't really have the infrastructure to then go and actually do something with the community they've built, the data set they've built, and maybe even funds that they can pull together. That's what these DAOs are. It's like the infrastructure to like not just talk about, these shared problems that we have, but it's like try and find solutions, right? This is where like the Reddit community becomes supercharged, right? It's like the ability to take action and solve your problems, not just, everyone share their anecdote of which plant works for them the best to solve hair loss.
Very cool.
One other sort of related topic, Benji, is sort of the global nature of what we do in Web3 and also the scientific community. Talk a lot about how the regulatory environment's constantly changing. We're real big fans of the UK passing some crypto legislation. Asia's been very welcoming to a lot of crypto businesses. And then here in the US with the SEC, there's been some friction. Do you have any sense of how, decentralized science, IP-NFTs, how this might play out either for the US or globally? Does it cause movements in where people will do their work, or do you think it might have sort of a happy outcome?
Yeah, it's awesome question. I'm trying to figure out how to take this one most productively. I think ultimately diseases are shared globally, right? And one of the things that the FDA looks at that is super important is diversity, right? Diversity is one of the most important metrics that they look at when they approve a trial, right? Just making sure that, you're not getting ethnicity specific findings. And so I think one of the best opportunities that some of these like biotech DAOs have is to tap into that global diversity that exists for a specific disease and find cures that are generalizable, right? You want something that will cure as many possible people that have a certain disease as possible. I think another way we think about like the global nature of Web3 is when it comes to the intellectual property system. So when you start a biotech company or file any sort of valuable IP, you have to go do it in every jurisdiction that you want protection in, right? Super inefficient process, copy pasting so much information. And like, ultimately it's the same concept, right? And like, we're a global, like the world is global. We want inventions to be global. We want benefit to be global. Yet we have jurisdiction specific intellectual property and patent offices, right? And so one thing that we're super bullish on and excited about is on-chain native IP, right? Where there's an IP system that exists exclusively on-chain, where the record of inventorship and ownership is on the chain. The rights are granted by the network, right? Rather than like I think it's important to like think of like, what is the definition of intellectual property, right? And it's basically to have certain rights that are granted to you for a certain invention, right? And rights have traditionally been, government granted and enforced, but we want to make them all like network and Ethereum EVM enforced, right? So that's kind of like the way that that we hope to push things in, where, not only are the people themselves global that are participating in this network, but the IP itself at its core is enforced by the network too. And where we aren't reliant on judicial systems and institutions to enforce the IP itself, but actually just, the smart contracts are executing and enforcing all of these rights on chain in a super transparent and censorship resistant way, especially when it comes to like compounds and drugs, which also themselves have different designations within certain countries of like, oh, it's illegal in this country, but legal in that one, right? Or and it's gray market here and black market there, right? Ultimately, if drugs are therapeutic, we want them to get to everyone. And it's important that we have supply chains and IP systems that accommodate for this global nature, with all of the caveats aside of, drugs are in the physical space and you kind of have to comply with the laws of each country. So yeah, I think this is where like network states actually become very interesting for us, where you have like a global network and supply chain of compounds that, aren't necessarily contingent on, other countries like rules and designations for therapies. One country might say psychedelics are, the most dangerous substance on earth. The other might, and then the research might show that they're actually one of the most powerful and therapeutic substances on earth. So, we would like for the science to lead the rulemaking and not have, political interests govern that. So I think this is another big thing we think about when it comes to like the global nature and how that relates with regulatory and politics is, just supply chains, patients, and like on-chain IP, all, being global by nature.
So what does it mean for the IP to be like recorded on chain? Like what is actually recorded on chain from like a technical perspective? And then the second question I had was like, do you like file for IP in different countries? It sounds like you don't, but like, what if somebody else did the same science in like one country and like filed with the government, and then, the government sided with them because, today, like, you still need to file patents with like, governments for approval and for like, for legal approval and stuff like that. How does that system work?
So the way it works currently is, yes, you have to apply for patents within a specific jurisdiction. So I think the EU has a Europe-wide patent office. Australia has an Australian patent office. Japan has its own. The US has its own, Canada has its own. And so you do need to apply for patents individually within each of those jurisdictions. So that's obviously a super laborious process, highly expensive. I think one of the things that like is very underappreciated is just like how much in legal fees is required to be spent in order to file all of these patents. And like, it's just an extra transaction tax, right? It's like a crazy gas fee, like in the physical space in order to file your IP, right? And we want the gas fee to be the Ethereum gas fee, not the, legal costs of filing all of these patents. And so when you ask like, what gets recorded on chain, I think it depends on the field, right? It depends on the grain at which an invention becomes like unique, non-obvious, and valuable, right? And so in pharma, I mean, it depends on the drug modality, right? If it's a small molecule, then a unique entity that can be patented is a small molecule structure. And so these are typically represented as a string, and there's coding systems like SMILES. I would look up SMILES, which is how small molecules are indexed. Biologics, like antibodies, could be indexed by their sequence. So it's just a list of amino acids. Genetic therapies can be listed by ACs, Ts, and Gs, and RNA therapeutics can be ACs, G and Us, right? So there are different ways to actually record what is a unique invention and finding with therapeutics. And our hope is that all filing for a patent is just recording one of these like strings or indexing systems on chain. And then everyone knows that you invented it. Invented it, found it, discovered it. Like it's all the same thing. Like you were the person to recognize a substance of matter as valuable and just to record it on chain, right? And so if someone can build on it, they have to reference your original finding, right? And then this kind of just builds on itself. And so at its core, like this is what we see as the IP-NFT, which is just like this record of value with regard to a certain like index. And then where that becomes valuable is when people start adding data on top of it. So when people actually synthesize that chemical and go test it in the lab and submit that data on chain and say, hey, look, like this drug's actually valuable. Like, look what it can do in the lab. And then, someone goes and tests it on mice. And then like if they own a piece of it, they have an incentive to shill it, right? And to publish that data. So it creates this like different incentive system that exists in science where like currently in science, you want to hide everything, right? It's like you want to keep everything close to your chest, but imagine the world in which you own a piece of what you create and all that's recorded on chain and everyone has to recognize that. And so you actually have an incentive to publish data because that increases the value of the underlying IP, assuming that IP is on chain. So yeah, it's kind of like a mind F.
Yeah. Especially with all the current publishing industry and all the incentives they have today, to your point, to hold on to it as long as possible. And maybe we'll expose some of the preprint data, but then there's debate. He found it and it was discovered. It's interesting to your point, because then you could almost have like subdivisions of that specific IP NFT to go off to your point and do additional work on it, but get some value accrual from the parent in some way. You get all these complicated, it's an open canvas for painting incentive designs.
Yes. And the transaction cost becomes so low, right? And so like the transaction cost associated with collaborating with the different scientists is so high because you need to get lawyers involved. You need to form a research agreement. You need to sign NDAs. Like it's just, by the time you run the calculation of how much is it going to cost to collaborate with this person, it's so high, it's just not worth it, right? And so this is why everyone keeps things close to their chest. But when it becomes as easy as just submitting transactions to Ethereum, the incentive to collaborate becomes super high, right? Because it costs nothing to collaborate, right? Like very, very little. And you can like basically form agreements by sharing ownership with someone else, right? Immediately you send them tokens on MetaMask, right? And now you're both incentivized to contribute data and value to this underlying piece of IP. And so this is what we see as the future of DeSci. It's just like where all these scientists are just incentivized to collaborate with each other. That's it. Like, it's quite simple. It's really, really simple. It's just, you want people to want to collaborate, right? Rather than hold their cards close to their chest. Like, it's just suboptimal. Like, we all know that people accomplish things better in teams. And like, this is what Bell Labs did so beautifully. They just got everyone under one roof, and we just want everyone, all of the scientific talent that exists out there to be under one roof and to all have aligned incentives. Like, it's it.
I love it. No, this is a beautiful vision, and you guys are making it happen. Well, one last question for you, Benji, and I'll hand it back to Sean in case he has any others. I just want to be kind of conscious of your time. If you look at the broader Web3 ecosystem, even let's say even outside of decentralized science, and you think about some things that people are trying to reinvent in decentralized ways, whether it's messenger or communication or data or compute or whatever, is there anything in your mind over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, people that are listening to this, that are builders in the space, are there any wish list of a thing or two that you would love to see people build out to help augment the work you're doing?
Definitely. And, I think the stuff that you guys are working on at Protocol Labs is super important, right? Like, all of this is about storage and compute, right? At its base layer. The being able to generate IP means nothing if you can't store it, right? And access it very quickly and have low latency compute and storage. Like, it's absolutely essential. I think once you start to get like slightly fancier, things like identity for us are so interesting, right? Like, the ability to know who are experts at what, to be able to validate certain piece of information about a person in the real world, or even on chain, but just, to be able to reliably query and discover who can create value in computational biology. If I want someone to improve my drug's efficacy, like, who do I go to, right? To be able to have that list of people that have demonstrated value, that, have PhDs or expertise in certain areas of research. I want to be able to query those lists and do so in a Web3 native way, ideally. And also, when it comes to this highly private data that we're talking about, if I can not have to sign an NDA, but just know that if anything bad happens, that I can, slash that person or, come after them legally for leaking data. That's super important. So I'm really bullish on ZK-KYC. I think that's absolutely one of the top applications of zero knowledge, because I think what's important to remember is, especially in health, it's diseases are personal health information. People don't want to reveal their identity, but there's certain things that are so valuable that you just need to know that if something goes wrong, that you can find out who those people are and have legal recourse or some sort of recourse. So yeah, I think identity is something I'm super bullish on. And I think another is just all the derivatives and options that have been the primitives and smart contracts that have been built in the DeFi space, just bringing them over to science. There's such a big problem in the de-risking of drugs that exists in VC currently, which is all of the VCs are incentivized to shill their portfolio companies, right? There are no short markets in private stage biotech companies, right? And so I think you just saw this. There's one company that just came out of flagship pioneering, and I forget the name. I'm sorry. I can look it up, but they basically just got in a ton of trouble because they were lying to their investors about the data that they were generating. And there was only one guy who could reproduce the results, and, no one else could reproduce them. And they raised this huge Series B for $400 million on the science that was fundamentally flawed, right? And it's just inefficient allocation of capital because there's no short markets, right? If you can short science, this thing becomes the whole scientific engine becomes much more capital efficient. And it's really missing from science, right? The ability to short bad science and penalize and have moral hazard when it comes to for allocation of capital and research, right? And I just think it could be super fun to also participate in these markets as a scientist, right? To be able to leverage your expertise. there's so much latent talent within, PhD programs of people that just get it when it comes to a certain disease and they can't exercise it, right? You have to wait for biotech companies to become public to speculate. And I think that there's just a lot of really cool talent that you can unlock when it comes to capital allocation that would be unlocked from markets and options markets, specifically around things like early stage science.
I love it. This is brilliant. This is a great shopping list. And especially love the idea of like bringing some of the sort of modern Web3 ideas to the scientific community, and non-pro, but, they've got their credentials of all the work that they've done on chain, airdrops, who knows? So it's a wide open design space.
Benji, I feel like I learned a lot today just listening to you. Learned a lot about DeSci, about IP, and then all these new ways of funding science. But, as someone who really hasn't studied science since my college days, like I am completely unaware, completely oblivious to all of these problems. So thank you for sharing all of this. I feel like I was like, oh, now I need to go do my own research and learn a lot more things. So that was super cool.
Same here, Benji. Thank you so much for taking some time. You dropped a lot of knowledge on us, and we were very much appreciative. And where can folks go to find out more about Molecule? Where can they go to get involved, participate, help the community? Anything we can do to promote?
No, I appreciate it so much. So our website's molecule.to. It actually will be changing soon. We got the molecule.xyz domain finally. So that'll be coming. That'll be coming in about a month or so. And other sites are bio.xyz. That's kind of this DAO accelerator program that we're working on as well. And then all of the DAOs themselves that we've funded to date that are already operating have their own socials and whatnot. But I think the most important thing is we're trying to help these underserved patient communities find solutions. So if you're listening to this and you feel underserved, please come let us know. We're trying to work for you. So really appreciate you guys having me. And if you want to reach out to me personally, I'm at Benji Liebo on Twitter. Slide into the DMs and, love nerding out about this stuff. So would love to rip this again anytime. Thanks so much.
Much fun. All right, Benji, thanks so much, man. We're going to wrap it. Pleasure as always.